Belder managed to keep hold of Liam's tie and hat, but his aim was off with his dress shirt, and it disappeared into the crowd. His act left him with an undershirt he teased up now and then, while showing just enough side chest to work the crowd. The room erupted with applause when the music faded, and even Kalira was on her feet cheering. In the end, she had to admit that nothing really happened, even if you look close enough, and in spite of Belder sitting right beside her, clutching Liam's hat and tie, she had to admit that she looked. Oh boy, did she look. Damn, Belder. Well, you travel in interesting company, princess. Alrada seemed to be taking all the catcalls, whistles and offers cast towards Liam in stride, watching as the human made his way back to their table, plonking himself down beside Belle. Young man, you've cost me a good bit of money tonight. It's just dinner and drinks, sir. Liam was flushed with the effort of his act, and he hooked an arm through Belder's. She, in turn, was still blushing deep azure, as more catcalls came from the other tables. Well, tossing your wardrobe to your young lady was a nice touch. Thomas and the boys will start, and they'll want a clothing allowance. Alrada smiled serenely, not minding the losses. Of course, that presumes you don't want to put any of our other services on the tab this evening. Would you consider a job? He's fine, thanks. Belder stared at that, shooting Alrada a glance. Just a harmless offer, he shrugged, looking Liam over, though it was genuine. Thanks, but my gal is right. I appreciate the offer, but I dance for fun. Liam grinned and kissed Belder's hand, as she held his woodenly. Anyway, your guys are great. Had a lot of fun talking backstage. You what? Belder's head whipped around, eyes wide. Oh, yeah. I mean, they only had one guy from Canada, but I must say he has speed and stamina. Alrada leaned over to Kalira and Desi. A shame your young man has his hands full. I could probably recoup the cost of this evening just by giving out his Omni number. Anyway, it's not like I get to host a princess very often. This would have been my treat even without your young friend's very impressive performance. I can believe that, Desi muttered. Even with a fresh act on stage, the nearby tables were still gawking at Liam and craning for a look. What do you mean, very often? Kalira asked. I mean, not to be rude, but not very often still means sometimes, doesn't it? Well spotted. Alrada slid his forefinger over his lips delicately, but his smile was pure sinful delight. Princess Kamordri comes every so often when she's entertaining. She loves to make a grand impression, but in private, her talents are, shall we say, somewhat lacking. That's really too much information? Alrada gave a delicate harsh shrug. I think she just tries to be congenial. Little seems to hold her interest, except herself, and coming to the tide pool is something of meeting her clients halfway. Frankly, she seems as interested in the floral arrangements as the boys. That's, a bit close to the mark, Kalira whispered, more than a little aware of the other nobility around the room. Like her mother's friend, Samila, Alrada seemed uniquely placed to glean interesting bits of information, if he chose to share it. You're a shrewd judge of character. I wouldn't be managing the tide pool if I wasn't, Alrada said, looking at her thoughtfully, as if weighing up options along the very same lines. I must say I agree with Samila, and after entertaining your sister, I'm convinced. Of course, I still have to exercise the greatest discretion when it comes to my clientele. But you can use a good friend in high places, can't you? Desi leaned in, while Kalira was thinking it over. She'd never been anyone's friend in a high place before, and now the option was staring her in the face. My advisor is right, Kalira nodded. The noise of the crowd made a conversation difficult, and there was no doubt her words weren't carrying beyond the table. My mother is good friends with Lady Samila, and I can't have too many friends. My dear princess, there's no such thing. Aralda purred as he leaned in, his hand brushing hers for a moment. As long as it's understood I'm a professional, I'm accustomed to getting good value for my services, no matter what they are. That isn't a problem, Kalira nodded, feeling like she just sealed a deal. Glancing off to her left, Jax had been quietly listening in and winked. Value or no, the matter we were talking about, that comes under an ongoing investigation. Official. Those aren't part of the deal. Just don't get in the habit of freebies, all right? He sighed dramatically. The woman you asked about? They talked for a while and even started to argue. Hiram had to threaten them with our Akiri girls to quiet them down. They did, and that's usually the end of it. A little while later, they went upstairs. That was a bit odd, as they hadn't ordered any boys. Or girls. Still, sometimes people do like to pick over the menu in private. Wait, what about the security footage? We don't have any security cameras beyond this floor. Once you're inside, you're a client, and that's that. Alrada shook his head. Even so, that's rather a lot of trust by our guests. My security girls walk around to prevent any scuffles, but cameras on the private floors? Our guests are grateful for our services, and very understanding of the safety of our staff, but there are limits. Kalira looked ready to argue the point, but Desi laid a hand on her forearm and shook her head. He's right. It's that kind of business. Fine, Kalira grumbled, thinking it over. So, Jubilee and the hooded woman went upstairs. What happened then? Did she kill her? They paid for a room, so they were there alone. Guests usually make a selection and are charged accordingly, but that didn't happen. Later that night, there was a lot of screaming. One of the boys found Jubilee trying to crawl out of the room, alone and dying from a stab wound. The hooded woman was nowhere to be found, though according to the footage on the ground, she had left well before. If she'd stabbed Jubilee, it took her some time to get to the door. There was a lot of blood, though. And there was no boy? Our customers come here for discreet and obliging companionship. We provide it without intrusive questions. They pay more here than anywhere else because our hosts are attractive, skilled, and discreet, and well paid. Alrada waved a hand towards a nearby table, where two boys were fawning over a woman who wore a blissful expression. None of their hands were visible above the table. Duchess Renala likes to buy her host shots of Anther Battle Glory, then slips rubies in their glass. No, Princess, our boys and girls do very well here, and there are far more than a few marriages on retirement. Lark had been blushing for the last few minutes, but was frowning thoughtfully. So, Jubilee, she was still alive when your people found her? Barely. Alrada shook his head dolefully. I sent for a doctor and notified one of our owners. If you managed all that, she must have lasted a while. Lark pressed the point, hanging on every word. We have a staff clientation for minor issues, but nothing like this. Alrada shrugged, and we didn't have to send far for Mr. Jimenez. The first night of Shell is one of his regular evenings. He's the only man on Shell who gets his entertainment for free. Jimenez? Neswa blinked in shock. Jama Jimenez? My word! You know him? Alrada smiled. He just came in the door. Neswa was staring wide-eyed, and pointed over Kalira's shoulder where the elderly professor stood, in an elegant purple and green suit, trading remarks with some of the working boys. Oh, this gets better and better, Alrada grinned mischievously. Hiram, be a dear and request Mr. Jimenez to join us, won't you? What did you do when she died? Kalira asked. She was staring at the remains of her dinner with a newfound fascination, while the girls facing behind her looked ready to die. Sitting beside her, Desi had gone pale. Naturally, we notified the authorities. Alrada nodded in a matter-of-fact manner. We don't get that kind of thing here, and it was the only proper thing to do. Kalira was trying to think of what to ask when she looked up. A moment later, Professor Hamaris arrived, grinning ear to ear. "Well now, Arada, my boy, you've been busy. And ladies, I must say this is a surprise." "Charmer, you didn't tell me you knew Princess Kalira." Arada smiled as the elderly shill sat down in the offered chair. "You've been holding out on us." The Cambrian's bushy eyebrows lifted as he glanced over to the host. "I what now?" "Princess Kalira Tazoo. Oh, Jama, you're such a tease." Arada nodded Kalira's way, and Jama followed his gaze. "And to think I only came in to arrange a bachelor party," he grinned. "This is going to be an interesting evening." Another party? Jama, the girls will be thrilled. Or will it be boys? Arada canted his head. Or both. Time for that later, I think. Jama looked around at the girls and studied Liam a moment. "Well now, I see what some of the fuss is about." Turning back to Kalira, he nodded deeply. "And you're enjoying our entertainment, I trust. Bit of an unusual class outing, isn't it, ladies?" "They're being very dreary, Jama." Arada sighed. "All they want to talk about is dead people." Well, that is one of my best subjects." "Professor," Kalira whispered, staring at him in shock. Mr. Hamaris, you're an owner here?" "Only 1%. Jama waved a hand dismissively. "A mere courtesy for services rendered, but it gets me off campus, and there's a lot to be said for a free meal and a show." "Among other things?" Arada arched an eyebrow. Desi reached out for a glass and started sipping her water while she blushed a deep cerulean. The other girls didn't say a thing, looking at one another awkwardly. "A 1% owner? Professor, how—" Desi looked around the vast theatre, desperately trying not to point everywhere at once. "I mean, it's just like the concert hall back on the campus. And how?" "Well, I shouldn't really say." Jama's grin said otherwise, as he leaned over to Arada. "They know what comes to the tide pool stays in the tide pool, right?" That she does, and I'm taking it as a given that her friends aren't going to go against her wishes, after all." Arada's smile was almost feral. He winked at the twins, who managed to arch an eyebrow back, almost in time to each other. "We've been discussing the most interesting arrangement. You should tell her the story. You know you're dying to." Well, Miss Deshin?" Jama leaned forward just a bit. Desi choked on her water slightly and set it down.
"Sir?"
"You're a bright young lass. You saw the statue out of the entry?" Jama folded his hands demurely at the table. "What can you tell us about it?"
Empress Maillard at the tide pool?"
"The very same." He nodded primly, looking like he was back in class, staring at Desi like a reluctant student. "Come now, lass. Fill this den of dubious desires with your brilliance."
Well, it's famous."
Desi stared at him, blushing as the other girl sat a little straighter.
"It was the biggest art theft in its day. Lost over 2 centuries until it was recovered about 25 years ago and returned to the Imperial Museum."
"Where you've viewed it, have you?" Jama asked archly, leaning in ever so slightly.
"No, sir."
Desi shook her head.
"It's not on display, I think. It's, considered—"
"Lewd," Jama said flatly. "They stuck it back in the archives where it's never seen the light of day since, because it's considered lewd."
I mean—"
"Young ladies, you can hear me lecture about artifacts from dead civilizations any time you wish." Jama tugged on his blazer primly. "Living cultures are another matter. Did you know that almost 10% of Rakiri cultural artifacts aren't even held on dirt? No. They're spread all over the galaxy in museums. Or worse,
in storage or private collections, where the very people who they hold significance to cannot see them all. So I found the statue as a young lad, had a copy made, and took the reward, most of which went to Alrada's grandmother when she started this place. Sniffing a bit, he looked back over at Kalira, defiantly. I may have made a few suggestions over the decor. And that's why this looks like the Academy Amphitheatre, Desi blurted out. Exactly! Well spotted, young lady, well spotted. So, you're a 1% owner? Kalira said incredulously. Of this? I had to do something with the money, he sniffed. Alrada's grandmother was a good businesswoman, and free dinners for life seemed like a very good idea at the time. You did all that to get a copy, and for free meals for life? Pris stared at him incredulously. You should see the way some of my peers eat. Free meals for life is a damn good idea as a young man trying to get started in life. Jama leaned forward, eyeing the remains of Pris's steak dinner. Besides, that's not a copy out front. That's the original. What? Desi shook herself, still feeling like she was in class. Sir? What? Listening but not hearing, Miss Palavant. Jama frowned, but his grin gave it no weight. That statue is a part of our culture. A living culture. It's got no business being crated up and locked away in some dusty storeroom. Kalira seemed to be grappling with it all. One of the most famous professional archaeologists in the Empire had just admitted to being a sneak thief of colossal proportions against the Imperial Museum, so the art could be seen for free dinners. I trust you're getting to the point, Princess, Jama said conversationally. I gather you're not going by Malondi this evening. I was asking how the body was found. Kalira tried to get some control, pushing the matter aside. That's right, Jama, Alrada nodded. You remember a few years ago, they came in asking about the murder of that woman, Jurelay. That's right. Lark grabbed hold of the thread. You said she was alive when you found her. Barely, Alrada shrugged. She was lying there in the doorway, bleeding out on the floor. Her tunic was soaked through. I summoned Jama. He tried to help her while I called for the doctor. Tunic? So she was dressed at the time? Fully. He nodded. I don't see what that has to do with anything. It means they were meeting alone to talk. Not much else, Desi nodded. What comes to the tide pool? Sepher muttered. Exactly, Desi nodded. Was there anything else you could tell us? Anything at all? Not really, lass. She had lost a great deal of blood and was quite delirious, just laying there muttering. Jama shook his head dolefully. She could barely speak, but it sounded like she was saying, dancer, dancer. Of course, the investigation checked our dancers. Our security cameras work very well on this floor. All of them were accounted for. Neither one of them was anywhere near. I can't believe it. Malondi, she could be Malondi again, shook her head. After all that happened the whole evening, the dinner, Liam dancing, the meeting with Alrada and then Professor Ramirez, out of all of it, she had been certain this would be the proof that Cordera Sariva was behind the attempts on her life. It was all for nothing. She'd gone from not thinking anyone was out to get her, to wondering who was out to get her, to being certain Comordra's agent Kadira was out to get her. Now she knew someone was, but had no proof except it wasn't Kadira. Maybe. It was enough to make anyone go insane with fear and worry, feeling like they had a targeting laser painting their back. That just made Belder completely annoying. They stayed well into the evening. After letting Sergeant Diani and Sergeant Jelk enjoy the amenities on the house for over an hour, the two women had come back a bit unsteadily, but with smiles a mile wide. It would have been an unthinkable breach of security anywhere else, but having a team of temperamental Rakiri watching over their table...
I just don't get it. How can we be wrong? She asked, as the autocab sped away from Swago Academy.
The others all wore thoughtful expressions, though the huge dinners might have been slowing them down. The only one who wasn't.
Belder, you've been staring a hole in the cabin ever since we dropped Liam off, Melondi sighed. Seriously, what is wrong?
He danced, Belder muttered, staring down as she wrung her hands in her lap. That's kind of an understatement, Willist. Pris leaned over and nudged her with a good-natured smile. He brought the house down in the most infamous night spot in the whole Empire. I know, Belle wailed. How can I ask a boy to marry me if he's going to go off and do that? What if my mothers and father found out?
Mine would probably say well done,
Jaxby muttered unhappily, as she stared at her omnipad, running numbers. Do you know how many bikinis I have to front for the Thai pool now? Free advertising my ass.
For women or men?
Sefe canted her head.
Jaxby whispered, bikinis. For men. You can't be thinking he's like that all the time, Belle, Pris offered. You've been seeing him for months now. He just likes to dance. Remember how proud you were of showing us the first time? This isn't so different. I don't know. I don't know. Is it?
Belle shook her head.
This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me in my whole life. How can I tell my parents what we were doing before getting engaged? Simple. Tell them you went out to dinner a lot and he dances. That's it. Desi said flatly. As conversations with parents go, it could be worse. Worse? Belder cried. How in the deeps could it be worse? Hi, Mum. Thanks for adopting me. I'm really looking forward to you and Shalea and Professor Warwick getting married, so I can have you as my mums and dad, Desi sighed. Did you know his bachelor party will be in the most infamous brothel in the galaxy?
And the first Rakiri says, that's not my brother in bed with you, that's an Alsatian. And the blonde one asks, so does that count as animal husbandry? Ductra laughed after finishing her story, before glancing over at Clips in the passenger seat. There wasn't even a chuckle. Look, I'm just saying you spooked him. Ductra shrugged as her utility van drove through the night after leaving the hospital. She looked over at the passenger seat, where a mass of bandages glared balefully back at her from one eye exposed. The damn thing was in my hair. Heavily sedated, but occasionally lucid, Clips was swaddled in gauze. The skin plaster applied over her arms, head, and torso didn't match her natural tone and gave her a mottled look. The woman should still have been in the hospital, but had forced herself through checkout. The fuck you think I spooked it? Just saying, Ductra shrugged. Shit. All you had to do was hold the ladder, but you didn't tell me you were still carrying around that damn sandwich. Now they've got in the way. Lick me! You said it was a predator. Why the fuck would an owls be going after my sandwich? Owl for one, owls is plural, and... Like I give a fuck! Clips tried to yell, but the gauze muffled her complaints. Between the almost physical funk coming off the unwashed telejournalist and the bandages along her hands and forearms, Clips vaguely reminded Ductra of a Rakiri she'd met, with a bad case of mange. Look, do you think you could just keep out of trouble? You know, heal up and shit so you don't look like you swan-dived into a sausage grinder? Ductra shook her head. And Drebner's tits, keep off the damn stims. You gotta clean yourself up. I won't be able to take you out for your big score. Clips rolled onto the side of her seat as she drifted back toward a coma. Hey, bitch, you still hearing me? Ductra shook her head and snapped her fingers in front of Clips, who leaned back and tried to focus. Look, you want that big story, you have to get yourself together. No way I can take you back to the palace looking like this. Tom lay back on his couch and drew the blanket up. The apartment wasn't cold, as such, but Miv thought it was freezing. Even though she was still fretting over his injury, she left tonight to get ready for class in the morning, with a promise to be back in time for breakfast. It wasn't late yet. That made it as good a time as any to make the call, and he slipped his Omnipad out and swiped the connection. The dial tone he set in place of the usual hum Shilvanti used as a default started. It rang 3 times before Shalea picked up.
"Hello, Tom. Are you all right?"
she asked anxiously. They tended to talk every other day, and this wasn't one of their normal evenings. "Hey, Leia. I'm fine," Tom said easily. "Miv just left, and I wanted to ask you something. I'm not sure if it's important, but I wanted to wait so we could talk alone."
"Sure."
There was a flomp sound, like she sat down heavily. For all that he committed to this, Leia still seemed nervous about being left out. He was going to have to do something about that.
"All right, go ahead."
"It's nothing bad, really." Tom rushed the words out, keenly aware he had no idea. "I just wanted to ask about the wedding. Setting it up? I know Miv is sort of a pantheist, but I didn't know if you're a particular denomination. You know, for the ceremony."
Oh!
Leia breathed a relieved sigh, then chuckled.
"A bit. I don't practice as much as I should, but I'm partial to shamantal. You know what that means?"
"Sort of." Tom racked his brains over the Shur pantheon. It was like an extended family with some obscure cousins, but Sham was right at the top. Even so, he groped through Jama's advice. "So you worship the sun?"
"I do. I can see Sham, and she gives me what I need and asks for nothing in return."
Leia had an iron streak to her character, and by the sound of her voice, she was suddenly past her anxiety.
"The warmth on my face? Sham brings life, so every day is my reminder to be as generous to others as she is to me. Shamantal makes me a better teacher, giving to others without expecting anything in return."
How's that work for a wedding?
"Oh, well, it just has to be held in the daylight."
Leia sounded happy as she explained.
"As long as there's daylight when we have the ceremony, Sham is included."
That made sense. The Shilvanti saw their deities in themselves, with all their virtues and faults. Strong family ties mattered. Anyway, a wedding during the day seemed easy. "All right. I'll try and find us somewhere nice. I've got money set aside and—"
"Tom, what are you talking about?" Leia broke in. "Don't be silly. You aren't paying for the wedding."
"Oh? I just presumed. Back home, it's the family of the bride that takes care of things. I sort of try to put it in reverse, you know."
"Well, that's very... I can see that, maybe, but no, we're supposed to take care of you."
Leia sounded delighted, and Tom relaxed on the couch, happy he'd made the call.
"Anyway, Miv paid for the wedding when I joined the family with Chanda. This time around, it's my turn for the 3 of us. Well, not me, exactly. My mothers have insisted for years that they'd pay if Miv and I found a man again."
Tom suddenly found his mouth hanging open, and closed it. Shil lived longer than humans. Of course, with imperial medical care, humans would catch up, but Miv's parents were dead. Why hadn't he thought about Leia's? "Your mothers insisted? That's very kind of them."
"Oh, they can hardly wait to meet you."
Leia's voice was all smiles.
"You just say the word, and they'll set up the retreat any shell before the wedding."
The what?" Tom felt like the floor was slipping out from under him. Over the last year, it had become familiar, but that didn't make the rush of vertigo go away, exactly. "Can you run that by me again, please?"
"Sure, honey. I'm not very devout, but my mothers are," Leia said. "That means you go camping together on a weekend retreat before we can get married, so they can get to know you."
Gumbri sat down next to Lark without a word. They hadn't spoken since before Lark's trip to the tide pool last night. Not since movie night, the night before. Bree had almost made it to the end of the movie, but the sight of males killing one another was too much, and she'd run off to the fresher as the story wound to its gory and surreal conclusion. Lark had rushed after and apologized, but Bree hadn't said much. She wondered if she might now. "Are you all right?" Lark asked. Bree was sitting there, looking at her sullenly. Her mouth twitched. "Am I all right?" Bree canted her head. Her lips pursed, and she stared at Lark like she'd never seen her before. "How could you watch that and ask if I'm all right?" "It was a special request," Lark said defensively. "None of the other human films we've seen were like that at all." "Special request for who?" Bree asked sullenly. By now, she would have usually had a hand on Lark's leg, or been scooting closer. Tonight, there was nothing. Remember I told you there were some things I can't tell you about yet? Look, I'm sorry. I can tell you're upset. I didn't know it was going to be that bad. It was a special request. I can't tell you for who, and I'd really appreciate it if you took my word on this. Please?" Lark looked at her helplessly. A month ago, she would have wondered why she was upset at Bree's distance. Now, she was. She could figure out why later. "Look, this was the first time we watched anything like that, and I was glad you came. If I'd known what we were seeing, I'd have asked another time." Bree slumped in Lark's direction. She wasn't close, but she unbent a little. "That's fair, I suppose," she said eventually. "I did ask to come without knowing what I'd be getting into. Just tell me, the request. It wasn't from your professor, was it?" "What?" "No, some people one of the girls knows was... Well, no, it wasn't him." Lark shook her head. "She had a request for a movie some military folks would like. The professor didn't have any idea. Why would you ask that?" "Why?" Bree blinked and stared at her, as if the question were ridiculous. "I'm the last woman to call someone primitive just because they're from a new world, but the word going around campus is that he cut a woman into pieces. How do I know what he's teaching you is safe?" "Bree, we're here to learn," Lark started off. In the back of her mind, the conversation she didn't want to have yet was playing on repeat. "Bree, I'm older than you and a reporter and not a noble. Look, we're reporters, right? For the V-blog? Not everything we're going to learn is safe or nice. And besides, it was only 2 pieces." "What?" Bree's eyes grew wide as saucers, but she leaned in protectively. That seemed better. "What do you know? I'm serious. If he isn't safe to be around, then..." "If he hadn't, I'd be dead," Lark said sharply, before looking around to see who was near enough to hear them. She slipped in close to Bree and whispered, "So were some of the other girls. That woman was going to kill us all." "You were there?" Bree turned pale, slipping a hand around her shoulder. "Lark, why didn't you tell me? Babe, you can talk to me." "I kind of can't. Like, legally, you know? Things I can't tell you yet. Anyway, the head administrator is still deciding about letting us put out the story." Lark did her best to explain. All of this would come out when they did a story, if they did a story, but Order 24 was preventing her from saying too much. It wasn't lying, but it was an act of omission. "When we do the story, you're helping me with it, alright? But Warwick isn't a monster, if that's what you're worried about." Well, I hope she hurries up. Everyone knows he did something, but the stories are starting to get a little weird." Bree frowned as she tugged at one of her pigtails. "The chocolate was good. You liked it?" Lark said hopefully. She felt relief and reached out to hold Bree's hand. This woman wanted to be her co. She wasn't entirely sure about how she felt about that yet, but seeing her in distress had hurt. "You have to try fried chicken with me," Next shell. Asking me on a date? Bree leaned in and rubbed against Lark. You're a smooth talker. Alright, I accept. Besides, I owe you. A what? Why? Let's make date night a thing. We can even try the movies again. I like your friends. Bree was off and running as if nothing had happened, putting Lark along for the ride. You held my hair when I was throwing up in the fresher, so I didn't have to get it out of my hair. Girl, that chocolate tasted a lot better going down than coming up. So, where were you last night anyway? Or is that a big secret too? It was the last day of Shell, and Melondi was in the gym. The hour was getting later, but that suited her well enough. The IOTC girls didn't seem to hang around at that time, and it let her have the training room to herself. She spent a good 10 minutes practicing flipping the blade from an outward thrust to the chambered position where Kerma taught her. Now, she stared at the target dummy and lunged again, stabbing in at a spot on its torso. Stepping back, she wore the knife in her right hand, keeping it moving, and checked her distance. Just close enough to reach, not too far to overextend. You're just going to keep doing that? Mel startled at the voice. Desi was there, leaning on the doorframe. It's not bad, but you won't get very far on the street like that. It's what I was taught, Mel said awkwardly. She still hadn't wanted to get involved with the IOTC girls. There would be too many awkward questions. It was humiliating enough that the death's heads watching her were probably thinking of a dozen different ways to correct every move. Anyway, how do you know so much? My co-mothers were useless for just about everything, but they still taught me how to take care of myself in a fight. Desi suppressed a grimace as she wandered over, picking up another practice knife. There are only a couple of small gangs out where I live, but you still don't want to get shaken down for money. Sooner or later, it's a good idea if people know you can handle yourself. You never know when you might need to use something as a knife, or just grab a pipe or some ceramicrete for a club. Melondi thought about what Desi was saying. It seemed so out of place. From the first day of school, Deshin had made herself over perfectly into the image of a young noble girl. She was always friendly, helpful and smart. She really was a good advisor. The gulf between their worlds never seemed so wide as it did at that moment. Okay, so if you're going to be my advisor, teach me, she said after a moment, straightening up. What am I doing wrong? Well, your grip is good. Desi came over and moved her hand slightly. But don't break your wrist like that. Keep it straight all the way from the tip of the blade back to your elbow. That way you put real power behind your thrust. And you're waving it around, but keeping it pointed at their eyes. Makes it harder to follow. Mel nodded and stabbed out at the target. It felt harder when she landed the blow. Good, Desi smiled. But thrust up, not straight. Never forget the way to a woman's heart. I'm guessing you don't mean a good meal. Nope. Desi stepped in and thrust at the dummy, jabbing sharply a couple of times. Up and under the ribcage. I bet you hadn't thought about gouging someone's eyes or spitting. Desi straightened up and grinned at Melondi's shocked expression. Yeah, seriously. I mean it, princess. If you ever have to use that, you're playing for keeps. I guess I hadn't thought of it that way. Mel looked down at the blade in her hand before trying to copy Desi's move. Blade fencing caught on in the court over the last few years, but knives? This still doesn't seem real. Just imagine the professor showing up at court with that sword. Desi grinned and thrust again. Not that it's a bad idea. My mother's always said you keep an opponent as far away as possible. If someone came at me with a sword like that, well, sure-sized, I'd be running for it. Yeah. Mel bit her lip thoughtfully. Do you think he'd teach us? Belda lay back in her bed and stared at her omnipad. Nesfa still wasn't talking. It had taken all day to get her nerve up to ask. She was still trying to wrap her mind around last night. Everything Liam had done on stage in front of her friends, in front of all those women. It was one thing to go dancing and show off, but he'd almost taken his shirt off, in front of everyone. All right, he tossed his top and his tie at her alone, and the undershirt stayed on. But all the jeers and comments. She tried to look proud and possessive when he'd come back to their table. She was. Of course she was. But it was something. She should have felt proud of her man, but was she? All of those women at the tide pool, women who could afford the tide pool. What did she have to offer? A title she'd inherit along with a few thousand miles of grazing Turoks? Willis had a handful of large cities, with nothing to compare to the big city life on Shill. Why wasn't Nesfa talking anyway? She'd asked her over dinner what was going on, and Nesfa only begged off. Again. Nesfa had everything she didn't. They were both nobles, sure, but Nesfa lived right here on Shill, had a big estate, and her money wasn't measured in wandering livestock. She didn't want to think he was looking for another woman. They didn't have an understanding yet. Why had she offered to wait until a 6th date? This should already have been settled. What if he changed his mind? She could ask him about Nesfa. What if he said he wasn't seeing her, but he really was? Goddess! What if he said yes? While identical in almost every way, Kamara's room had the better view over the commons. So, by general accord, the twins had adopted it for private talks. I'm just saying anyone could have been worse, Mara said, settling back on her bed. Are you kidding me? Lynn flopped on the floor to lean against the dresser, her look questioning her sister's sanity. It's the biggest brothel in known space, and the mister wanted us for a foursome on stage. Who knows what could have happened? Desi looked like she was thinking it over, so exactly how could it be worse? We lost our composure. Not exactly. Mara had a pained look. All right, it was a close call, but we're adults now. How are we ever going to get guys? We can't just lose it over intimate situations. Mara, that was more than an intimate situation. Lim was shaking her head in sheer disbelief. We're engineers. Our odds of getting a guy are bad enough as it is. You know what I'm talking about, Mara grinned, and tried to make her point. What if it had been Aku with us instead of Liam? That's easy. I'd die of embarrassment right after I killed you. Lynn's eyes narrowed. Fine, that would have been worse, but why Aku? We've agreed he's in the friend arena. You aren't thinking of... No! Goddess, no! Mara shook her head quickly. He's out of our league. It's just that he messaged us, you know? What? When? Lynn sat up. I left my Omnipad in my room. What did he say? He needs to put off a visit. He has to go on tour and hoped we could send him some films. Maybe we could ask the professor. Lim bit her lip in thought. We're definitely previewing anything we send him, though. No argument, Mara nodded. It's just, we need to start growing up a bit. Around guys, I mean. Ganya settled back in her favourite chair after dinner and sipped at her drink. Becky Juice was fine during the week, but the last night of Shell, she kept aside for herself and her family. That one night, anything short of emergencies stayed outside. It wasn't working tonight. She put matters off, hoping things might calm down with the press of events. It wasn't happening. Rumours were starting to spread. Actual news channels were pressing her office for an official release. It would have to match the official story, of course, but something needed to be done. You might as well tell us. You've been fretting all Shell. Her husband, Biram, sighed. Whatever it is, it can't be that bad, can it? She looked up at her husband and co-wife, Nedrin, and offered them a tired smile. They were always so good to her, but this couldn't be put off.
It was just so difficult not to share the details. They were her bedrock, and now there was so much she couldn't say.
I suppose not. Not as such,
Ganya nodded, and Biron got that look in his eyes that pressed her to continue, while Nedrin reached out and refilled their glasses.
It's all to do with that business from before the vacation. The Academy has got to issue a statement to the press. I've already spent days with the legal department, and I have just the girl to put it together. I've just been putting it off.
If you have a path out of this mess, why in Plutara's name don't you just take it? Nedrin asked. It sounded so innocent, the way she said it.
I do. It's just this business around Warwick.
She shook her head. It took weeks before that last reporter stopped lurking around the front gate.
I know I can't put this off any longer, but I don't want to go back to that. It looks awful. I have to shelter the man. I want to. But once we put the story out, we could have reporters sitting there until solstice.
Why not get rid of him for a little bit? Biron said, holding up a hand as Ganya gave him a look. It's almost time for the teacher exchange program, isn't it? I mean, he is one of your professors, after all. Ganya's protest died in her mouth. Warwick was a legitimate professor. He'd proven that. And the school exchange program was for junior professors. Maybe it was just the unusual circumstances, the attack, the princess, but exchange week was just around the corner, and it would get him away. That would put him off campus for over a week, she said after a moment. He might enjoy some time teaching at Soche Pan Technical. Ganya, really? Biron looked pained. Why Soche? You and their administrator, Vemi Rasani? You absolutely loathe the woman. You get along like two yes-chefs tied up in a sack. Yes, well, it would be good for school relations. Ganya smiled like a Preltha, as her mind ran over the possibilities. Her drink tasted so much better now.